Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. From yarn bowls to ball winders, gauge rulers to row counters, we knitters love our tools and gadgets. Today, I'd like to tell you about a knitting tool that I frequently use in my own studio, but you might be surprised that it's probably something that's not available to buy at your favorite local yarn shop. It is a food scale. And confession time. I knit for many years without having a scale. I originally bought this one back when I was still selling my handmade items online, and I used the scale to help me accurately calculate postage costs. And then I realized a variety of ways that a simple food scale can be used to make knitting easier. Today I'll share 6 things knitters can do with a food scale that have nothing to do with shipping or snacking. Let's get started. If you're a 2-at-a-time sock knitter, this first task is a game changer. You can use a food scale to easily divide one ball of yarn into 2 equal-sized balls of yarn. You start by simply measuring your yarn and then wind off half into a separate ball. This makes things so much easier because then you're not knitting from both the inside and outside of the same yarn cake, which if you've ever done it, you will know can be disastrous. Next, a food scale can be used to adjust the length of your project so that you can use up all of your yarn and minimize your leftover bits. I use this most frequently when I'm doing toe-up socks. I generally don't knit my socks 2 at a time. So I'll measure out my yarn. I'll knit the toe, foot, heel of the sock as the pattern directs, and then I can just continue knitting the leg until half of my yarn has been used. And the same thing could be done for a scarf or a shawl. As you're knitting, just measure how much yarn is used across a certain length of the pattern. That way you can know how much length you can add to the project based on how much yarn you have. At some point, just about every knitter has played yarn chicken, when you're trying to use every last bit of yarn and you're not sure if you have enough. Sometimes we win and sometimes we lose. A food scale can help you win every time. While you're knitting your project, measure how much yarn is used over a certain length of knitting. Then you can use that information at the end to estimate how much length you can knit based on how much yarn you have left. If you're like me and you simply can't part with your leftover bits of yarn when you finish a project, at some point you're probably going to want to make something with those scraps. Most patterns will tell you the yardage you need to complete a particular project, but measuring the length of these scraps would be a daunting task. Instead, you could weigh the scraps to calculate the length of the yarn that you have. Just remember, you're going to need information from the yarn ball band. You'll need to know the original ratio of the weight to the length so that you can do the math to estimate your yardage. If you're following a pattern, it's likely that both the finished project dimensions and the amount of yarn you'll need to complete the project are specified in the pattern. But if you're feeling bold and experimenting with your own project design and yarn from your stash, you won't necessarily have that information or even be able to make a reasonable estimate. That's when it's time to knit a swatch, block it, and then grab a ruler and your food scale. After blocking, use a ruler to measure and calculate the area of the swatch that you knit, and then you can weigh that swatch. Once you have those 2 pieces of information, the area and the weight, you can determine one of 2 things. You can either determine the amount of yarn that you're going to need to make a project that is a certain size or area, or you can determine the size of the project that you can make based on the amount of yarn that you'd like to use. This last task is something designers do that knitters may not be aware of. From socks to sweaters, when patterns are graded for multiple sizes, it's simply not feasible to have samples knit in every single size. But knitters are still going to need to know how much yarn is required for the particular size they want to make. With the weight of 1 or 2 sample pieces and equations that define the areas of each different size, a designer can come up with very good estimates for how much yarn will be required to create each of the sizes in the grading. I hope you enjoyed learning about one of the most useful tools in knitting that you won't find in a yarn shop, a food scale. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. And if you'd like to support the ongoing free knitting tutorials on this channel, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com when you're ready to cast on your next favorite knitting project. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!